Along the border between Nepal and China rises the highest mountain on Earth. Mount Everest stands at 8,848 meters above sea level, forming part of the vast Himalayan range that stretches across South Asia. The mountain is built from layers of ancient seabed rock lifted upward by tectonic forces over millions of years. Above roughly 8,000 meters, the mountain enters a region climbers refer to as the death zone. At this altitude, atmospheric pressure is only a fraction of what exists at sea level. Oxygen levels are so low that the human body begins to deteriorate even while resting. Movement becomes slow and deliberate. For most of the year, Everest is exposed to strong winds from the jet stream. Temperatures remain far below freezing. Snow accumulates along ridges and in narrow couloirs where avalanches occasionally break loose. Storm systems can form quickly, moving across the upper slopes with little warning. Despite these conditions, a short window appears during late spring. In May, the jet stream often shifts slightly north. Winds weaken for brief periods, creating conditions that make summit attempts possible. During this narrow season, small groups of climbers move gradually upward along the mountain's southern route. Their camp steps slowly toward the summit ridge, each one placed higher in thinner air. From a distance, the mountain appears still. But each climbing season brings a temporary human presence to its upper slopes. In the spring of 1996, a number of commercial expeditions assembled at the base of Mount Everest on the Nepal side of the mountain. The climbing season had begun. Tents, supply caches, and communication equipment formed a temporary settlement on the Khumbu Glacier. From this location, expeditions prepared for several weeks of acclimatization before any attempt on the summit. Among the climbers present that season was Sandy Hill Pittman. She was an American journalist known for her work covering society and media. Pittman had written for several publications and had experience reporting from major international events. Her interest in Everest was partly journalistic. She intended to document the expedition and transmit reports from the mountain using satellite communication equipment. By the mid-1990s, Everest climbing had begun to change. Earlier expeditions were typically organized by national teams or experienced mountaineering clubs. But during that decade, commercial guiding companies expanded their operations. These organizations provided logistical support, Sherpa staff, and fixed ropes that allowed clients with limited high-altitude experience to attempt the summit under professional supervision. One of the most established guiding companies operating that year was Adventure Consultants, led by the New Zealand mountaineer Rob Hall. Hall had already guided several successful Everest expeditions and had developed a structured system for moving clients safely through the mountain's camps. His team included experienced Sherpa climbers responsible for establishing ropes and transporting supplies to higher elevations. Another member of the expedition was John Krakauer, a writer who had been sent by Outside magazine to report on the growing commercial climbing industry. Krakauer was an experienced mountaineer and intended to document the expedition while also attempting the summit himself. Pittman joined this group as a paying client of the expedition. Compared with professional climbers, her technical mountaineering background was limited. However, the commercial structure of the expedition meant that clients relied heavily on guides and Sherpa staff for navigation, route preparation, and logistical support. During April, the team established their main base camp at approximately 5,300 meters. From there, they began a series of acclimatization rotations. These trips allowed climbers to gradually adapt to the decreasing oxygen levels at higher elevations. The first obstacle above base camp was the Khumbu Icefall, a shifting field of broken glacier blocks. Climbers crossed it using ladders and fixed ropes installed by specialized Sherpa teams. Beyond the icefall lay the western Khum, a wide valley enclosed by steep walls of ice and rock. Over several weeks, the expedition moved supplies upward through this route. Camps were placed progressively higher along the mountain. Each climb and descent allowed the body to adjust slowly to altitude. By early May, the climbers had completed most of their preparation. Attention began to shift toward the summit. By early May 1996, the teams climbing on the south side of Mount Everest had completed several weeks of acclimatization. Climbers had moved repeatedly between the mountain's camps, allowing their bodies to adjust gradually to lower oxygen levels. The route from base camp followed a sequence that had become standard on the southeast ridge. After crossing the Khumbu icefall, climbers entered the western Khum, a broad glacial valley surrounded by high walls of ice. From there, the route continued upward to Camp 2 at roughly 6,400 meters. Above this point, the terrain steepened. Camp 3 was established on the face of the Lhotse Wall, where climbers used fixed ropes to ascend the hard blue ice. Higher still, at approximately 7,900 meters, sat Camp 4 at the south kernel. This exposed saddle between Everest and Lhotse served as the final staging point before a summit attempt. On the afternoon of May 9, climbers from several expeditions gathered at Camp 4. Weather conditions appeared stable. Winds had temporarily weakened, creating what guides believed might be a suitable window for a summit push. Late that evening, small groups began leaving their tents. The summit attempt started in darkness. Climbers wore headlamps and moved slowly along the fixed ropes leading up the southeast ridge. Progress was steady but slow. Sections of the route required climbers to pass one another along narrow ridges and steep rock steps. These delays caused the line of climbers to stretch out along the mountain. As the night continued, individuals moved higher toward the summit ridge. Behind them, Camp 4 remained the last secure camp on the mountain. Above it, there were no permanent shelters. Only the summit and the long descent back to the south kernel above the South Col. The route toward the summit of Mount Everest follows the southeast ridge. The path climbs gradually at first, then steepens as it approaches the upper ridgeline. At this altitude, above 8,000 meters, every movement requires effort. Climbers often stop after a few steps to regulate breathing. During the early hours of May 10, 1996, climbers from several expeditions were spread along this route. Most were using supplemental oxygen. The systems consisted of metal cylinders, regulators, and masks designed to deliver a controlled flow of oxygen. Even with this assistance, physical performance remained limited. Movement was slow but steady through the darkness. As dawn approached, the ridge became more visible. The terrain narrowed, and the exposure increased. To the right, the Kangshung face dropped steeply into Tibet. To the left, the southwest face fell toward Nepal. The route followed a line of fixed ropes anchored to rock and snow along the ridge crest. Among the climbers on the route was Sandy Hill Pittman, moving with support from Sherpa guides and using supplemental oxygen. Her pace reflected the conditions experienced by most climbers at that altitude, measured, deliberate, and frequently interrupted by rest. As the sun rose over the Himalaya, the line of climbers became more visible along the ridge. Teams from different guiding companies had started their summit pushes at roughly similar times. This created sections where climbers gathered in small clusters while waiting for others ahead to move through technical portions of the route. One such obstacle was a steep rock outcrop near the upper ridge known as the Hillary Step. At the time, this feature required climbers to ascend a near-vertical rock face using fixed ropes. Because only one person could move through the section at a time, delays sometimes formed. The waiting periods had consequences. At extreme altitude, remaining stationary for extended periods can accelerate fatigue and cooling. Oxygen supplies are also consumed more quickly than planned when the climb takes longer than expected. Throughout the morning, climbers continued upward. Some reached the summit earlier in the day. Others arrived later than the turnaround times recommended by their guides. Turnaround times are an important element of high-altitude expeditions. Guides typically establish a specific hour, often early afternoon, after which climbers are expected to abandon the summit attempt and begin descending. The rule exists because descending the mountain safely requires daylight, energy, and sufficient oxygen reserves. But enforcing these limits can be difficult once climbers are near the summit. By midday on May 10, several climbers from the guided expeditions had reached the summit of Everest. The summit itself is a narrow, snow-covered dome. From that point, the horizon stretches across the Himalayan range, revealing distant peaks and valleys far below. Time spent at the summit is usually brief. The greater challenge remains the descent. Descending from the summit requires climbers to retrace the same exposed ridge and technical sections used during the ascent. Fatigue is often greater during the descent, and concentration must remain constant. During the afternoon of May 10, conditions on the upper mountain began to change. Cloud formations increased across the sky above the summit ridge. Winds, which had remained relatively moderate during the morning, began to strengthen. Temperatures dropped as the afternoon progressed. Climbers who had reached the summit began descending toward the south. The line of climbers again moved through narrow sections of the ridge and across the Hillary Steppe. For many individuals, oxygen supplies were becoming limited. Regulators required careful adjustment to maintain a consistent flow rate. If the flow was set too high, the cylinder would empty earlier than expected. If it was set too low, the climber could experience dizziness or impaired coordination. Several climbers reported difficulty locating spare oxygen cylinders that had been cached along the route. As the afternoon continued, the distance between climbers increased. Some groups descended steadily toward the south. Others remained higher on the mountain. Visibility gradually declined as cloud cover thickened. Wind speeds increased. In high-altitude environments, storms can develop rapidly. When clouds move across the summit ridge, visibility may fall to only a few meters. Landmarks that guide climbers along the route can disappear entirely. The fixed ropes remain the primary reference for navigation under such conditions. By late afternoon, snow began to move across the ridge under strong wind gusts. Climbers descending toward Camp 4 had to maintain careful contact with the rope line while moving slowly down steep snow slopes. At this stage of a summit day, fatigue becomes a major factor. Many climbers have already been moving for more than 12 hours. Dehydration, cold exposure, and reduced oxygen levels affect coordination and judgment. For some individuals on the mountain that day, the descent took longer than expected. The distance between the summit and the South Col is not large in absolute terms, less than 1 kilometer vertically, but at extreme altitude the journey can require many hours. As darkness approached, the weather continued to deteriorate. Snowfall increased across the upper slopes. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility further, covering sections of the route that had been visible earlier in the day. Climbers who had not yet reached Camp 4 were now navigating the ridge in near whiteout conditions. Communication between individuals became difficult. Headlamps illuminated only short distances in blowing snow. For those still high on the mountain, the descent toward the South Col had become increasingly uncertain. The storm that would later be known as part of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster was now fully developing across the upper slopes of Everest. By the evening of May 10, the storm had fully formed across the upper slopes of Mount Everest. Wind carried snow across the southeast ridge, reducing visibility to only a few meters in some areas. The line of fixed ropes that normally guided climbers down toward the South Col became difficult to follow beneath drifting snow. Several climbers were still descending from the summit when the storm intensified. Fatigue had accumulated after many hours of movement in thin air. Oxygen supplies were running low for some individuals. In the darkness and blowing snow, groups became separated along the ridge. A number of climbers lost the route entirely. Above the South Col, the terrain slopes gradually but remains exposed to wind. Without clear visibility, it became possible to move in the wrong direction across the open snowfields. Some climbers wandered away from the rope line while attempting to locate the camp. During the night, Sherpa guides and surviving climbers attempted to locate those who had not yet returned. Among those stranded high on the mountain was Rob Hall, the expedition leader of Adventure Consultants. Hall had remained on the mountain with one of his clients, Doug Hansen, who had reached the summit late in the day. Both men became trapped high on the southeast ridge during the storm. On another part of the route, the American guide Scott Fisher, leader of the company Mountain Madness, was also descending in deteriorating conditions after reaching the summit. Exhaustion and altitude slowed his progress as the storm intensified. Elsewhere on the upper mountain, the Japanese climber Yasuko Namba was caught in the same conditions while attempting to descend with other members of her group. Through the night, wind and snow continued across the ridge. Some climbers eventually located Camp 4 at the south kernel, others remained stranded on the slopes above it. During the following hours and into the next morning, rescue efforts were attempted by Sherpa climbers who moved upward from the south col when the weather allowed brief movement. Not all of the stranded climbers survived the night. Meanwhile, Sandy Hill Pittman had begun descending earlier with the assistance of Sherpa support and supplemental oxygen. Despite the deteriorating weather, she was able to continue moving toward Camp 4. By the morning of May 11, survivors from several expeditions had gradually gathered at the tents on the south kernel. The storm had scattered climbers across the upper mountain. Its consequences were only beginning to become clear. By the morning of May 11, conditions on the upper slopes of Mount Everest began to stabilize. The storm that had swept across the summit ridge during the previous night moved eastward. Winds remained present, but visibility improved enough for climbers at the south col to assess the situation. Several survivors from different expeditions had reached Camp 4 during the night or early morning. Others had required assistance from Sherpa climbers who moved out from the tents when weather conditions briefly allowed it. Some individuals were suffering from severe exhaustion, frostbite, and the effects of prolonged exposure to altitude. The events of the previous hours had also resulted in confirmed losses on the mountain. Climbers who had been caught high on the southeast ridge during the storm did not return to camp. Once the immediate situation at the south col had stabilized, attention shifted toward descending the mountain. The route downward retraced the same path used during the ascent. From Camp 4, climbers moved carefully down the steep slopes toward Camp 3 on the Lhotse face. Fixed ropes allowed controlled descent along the hard ice surface. Lower on the mountain, the air gradually became denser. Oxygen levels increased slightly with each 1,000 meters of descent. This allowed climbers to move with somewhat greater stability than they had experienced above 8,000 meters. Sandy Hill Pittman descended. With other surviving members of the expedition, assisted by Sherpa guides and support staff. The process took time. Movement remained slow due to fatigue and lingering weather conditions. Over the following days, the climbers continued downward through Camp 2, across the western Khum, and eventually through the Khumbu icefall. One by one, survivors returned to base camp. The expedition was over. But the full scale of what had occurred on the mountain was still being understood. By the morning of May 11, conditions on the upper slopes of Mount Everest began to stabilize. The storm that had swept across the summit ridge during the previous night moved eastward. Winds remained present, but visibility improved enough for climbers at the south col to assess the situation. Several survivors from different expeditions had reached Camp 4 during the night or early morning. Others had required assistance from Sherpa climbers who moved out from the tents when weather conditions briefly allowed it. Some individuals were suffering from severe exhaustion, frostbite, and the effects of prolonged exposure to altitude. The events of the previous hours had also resulted in confirmed losses on the mountain. Climbers who had been caught high on the southeast ridge during the storm did not return to camp. Once the immediate situation at the south col had stabilized, attention shifted toward descending the mountain. The route downward retraced the same path used during the ascent. From Camp 4, climbers moved carefully down the steep slopes toward Camp 3 on the Lhotse face. Fixed ropes allowed controlled descent along the hard ice surface. Lower on the mountain, the air gradually became denser. Oxygen levels increased slightly with each 1,000 meters of descent. This allowed climbers to move with somewhat greater stability than they had experienced above 8,000 meters. Sandy Hill Pittman descended with other surviving members of the expedition, assisted by Sherpa guides and support staff. The process took time. Movement remained slow due to fatigue and lingering weather conditions. Over the following days, the climbers continued downward through Camp 2, across the western Khum, and eventually through the Khumbu icefall. One by one, survivors returned to base camp. The expedition was over. But the full scale of what had occurred on the mountain was still being understood. The events of May 10 to 11, 1996, became known as the 1996 Mount Everest disaster. 7 climbers lost their lives across multiple expeditions, and several others survived only with assistance. Accounts from survivors, including John Krakauer and Sandy Hill Pittman, were later documented in books and reports. The disaster highlighted the risks inherent in high-altitude climbing, the challenges of weather unpredictability, and the pressures of commercial guiding. It also demonstrated the limits of human endurance in the death zone. Everest remains a peak of extremes. Experience, timing, and environmental conditions continue to determine survival. The mountain endures, indifferent, quietly observing each new season of climbers who test themselves upon its slopes.